Hi there. Welcome to the Department of Youth Services podcast, The Future in Focus. I'm your host, Chava Sukos, the Public Information Officer here at DYS. I appreciate you joining me here for episode 2 of our journey through juvenile justice. In the first installation, we gave you an overview of the agency and where it's headed with Director Amy Ast and Assistant Director Janine Trim. Moving forward, we'll be more specific, talking with leaders in different divisions to learn more about what they do and the positive change they're trying to achieve. In this episode, we're highlighting our anti-human trafficking efforts on the heels of Human Trafficking Prevention Month in January. Joining me is DYS's Human Trafficking Liaison, Chelsea Gaffey. Chelsea, welcome.
Thank you.
So, what is a Human Trafficking Liaison?
So in the context of specifically what I do as a human trafficking liaison at DYS, I primarily work internally on anything related to human trafficking in our agency. So that could be policies, procedures, making sure those things are updated around our response to human trafficking. I monitor our screening tools and make sure those are completed, and then connect our youth with any services if we identify someone as a victim of human trafficking. Externally, I work closely with the Governor's Human Trafficking Task Force, as this position is part of that, doing trainings in the community, specifically with juvenile courts, and really working on addressing human trafficking from a statewide level.
So we'll touch upon those points as we delve deeper later on, but specifically about you and your involvement and how you got into it. You have a degree in social work. After school, you worked for socially oriented organizations like Big Brothers Big Sisters, the Peace Corps, Salvation Army, before coming to DYS 3 years ago. So how did you end up in this realm, going against the perils of human trafficking?
Yeah, so really my work specifically with human trafficking started when I was in the Peace Corps. I joined the Peace Corps in 2011 and was assigned to the Philippines. So when I worked there, I stayed there for 2.5 years. Because of my background in social work, I was assigned to work at a center for women and girls who were victims of various crimes, one of those being human trafficking, which really got me more aware and interested and passionate about the anti-trafficking work. So when I returned to the U.S., continuing as a social worker, I really looked for ways that I could make a difference here in the United States with anti-human trafficking efforts. So it's kind of really what got me started in that work.
Sure. So you springboarded that in a more involved manner, getting to the Salvation Army. So what drew you to DYS to carry on in that capacity?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, when I was working for Salvation Army, it was specifically anti-human trafficking work there as well. Direct service with folks who had experienced human trafficking. On an individual level, I was working with them one-on-one. As I continued that work, I started thinking that I would love to work more at a macro level on statewide policies, systems issues that we were seeing with human trafficking and access to resources. And one of the things that we know about human trafficking is that often there's an intersection with justice-involved individuals in human trafficking. So when this opportunity presented itself, it seemed like a really great opportunity for moving forward in this work.
Sure. So are you the first DYS human trafficking liaison then?
I am not. I am the second.
The second, okay.
Yeah. So someone had this position for about 3 years before I started here. So this position was created through a grant that came through the Governor's Task Force. And so the first human trafficking liaison at DYS started about 2016 or 2017. And so I am the second.
So you touched about it briefly in terms of the work you do to identify people who are justice involved in human trafficking. That's part of the transition we go through here. So when we all start in pre-service, or we all start as new hires at DYS, we go through a 3-week program called pre-service where we learn a little bit of everything. You're a part of those proceedings in terms of giving us a better context in terms of what we're looking for and what we're doing. So for those who don't know, and a lot of us learning there for the first time, how does somebody who's a human trafficking victim or survivor end up in the justice system?
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned this, and I'll probably mention it a few times more as we're talking, just because we're talking about justice-involved youth. So one of the things that we know, like I mentioned, is that human trafficking victims are often required to commit crimes by their traffickers. And so we see that a lot of our kids are very vulnerable, and traffickers prey on those vulnerabilities. And so a lot of times through that, they're leveraging those vulnerabilities to get youth to do what they want them to do. And often those are things that you could be charged with, crimes, right? So we know that a lot of times, because traffickers are requiring their victims to commit crimes, some of the kids that come into our system are going to have that intersection of human trafficking, but also having committed crimes as part of their trafficking. And so there could be various reasons why victims of trafficking may end up in our systems, but that is one of those reasons, and probably one of the main reasons that we see some of our kids who are human trafficking victims ending up in our system.
So DYS does hundreds of these screenings a year when youth come into the system. Who does the screenings? What happens during a screening? What is staff trying to identify within these screenings?
Yeah, so we do screenings in our facilities, and we do them at multiple points. So we do them when kids come in initially before they leave the orientation unit. So it's usually within their first 7 days at the facility. We do it again at 90 days, and we do it again 7 days before they're released. So that's several times that we do the screenings. They're primarily handled by our BHS behavioral health staff, just because it made sense to have them do it, but it is not a requirement that BHS staff do it. Anyone could be trained to do these screenings. However, the way our system is set up right now, it makes most sense for behavioral health staff to be doing those. We do this at multiple points because we know that a youth might not be comfortable disclosing in their first 7 days that something has happened. And so we do it again. Hopefully they're more comfortable at that point, or maybe they're more comfortable with the screener at that point, the person doing the screening. And then we do it again, like I mentioned, before they leave our facilities. And part of that is to try to capture if any recruiting has gone on while they're in our facilities. So maybe there's been peer recruitment or something like that while they're in our facilities, and so we're trying to capture that as well. We also do a screening again when they've been released to parole at 90 days, once they've been released to parole, and those are done by our parole officers. And that is, again, maybe they feel more comfortable talking to their parole officer, but the other part is trafficking may have occurred again. So once they're released, they're potentially really vulnerable in the community again. And so again, that could be another connection to a trafficker, a point where they get reconnected with a trafficker. And so we want to do another assessment to see if that's going on and get them connected to resources in the community.
So when somebody's been identified or says shared that they're a victim or a survivor, what happens next?
Yeah, so we have a policy related to this. So there is like sort of a channel of things that we follow laid out in our policy. But one of those things is that I'm reviewing those screenings, and then also the person doing the screening will loop me into letting me know that they've identified someone who is a victim of human trafficking. And so at that point, I go and meet with the youth and talk with them a little bit about their victimization, have a conversation with them around that, and let them know that there are additional supportive services that they can access because they are victims of human trafficking. At that point, I talk to them about what those referrals would look like. But one thing I want to make sure that we talk about is that this is an option for them. When they have been someone who has experienced trafficking, everything is out of their control. They don't have a lot of choice in things. And so the last thing we want to do is provide services that feel like they're being required to complete those services around something like that. So this is an option for our youth. It's an additional service. They can choose to engage or not engage with it. And so I will say, though, most of our youth do choose to engage with that service. It is just an additional support for them, and it's someone coming in from outside of DYS to just talk with them about their experience and the trauma related to their trafficking. The other thing I do then is continue to meet with the youth to see how effective that referral is, if they feel like it's beneficial for them, if there's any issues going on with it, and just kind of maintain some measure of making sure that those are appropriate and good referrals for them.
Sure. In terms of referrals, resources, what all are you trying to basically get them connected with? I imagine housing, some sort of, as you alluded to, kind of trauma responsive care and all that.
Yeah, so primarily because most of our youth are identified while they're in the facilities, we are mostly connecting them with additional like trauma-informed services. And those people are talking to them about what they can access when they leave as well. The team that we work with, the organization that we work with, is really comprehensive in trying to create a treatment plan. And so some of that is related to housing. Mostly they're talking about safe and healthy relationships. What does that look like? What do healthy relationships look like? How to understand when a relationship is unsafe or unhealthy. A lot of our kids maybe don't have that experience of understanding what a safe and healthy relationship may look like. And traffickers can be really manipulative and confusing. So The team that we work with that provides services to our youth really works on focusing on what safe and healthy relationships look like as they're moving back into the community.
You mentioned before, it's a pervasive issue, comes in many channels and come any number of directions. Once you identify it, we obviously try to correct it from there moving forward, but you're also, as you mentioned earlier, through our connections with the juvenile justice system, being the courts in particular, because every time a youth comes to DYS, it's through a judge's decision, sentence, what have you. So what are you doing with these juvenile courts to help maybe identify things even before they get to DYS?
Yeah. So one of our initiatives is prevention work. So that looks like trying to help implement screening processes and providing education and trainings. So we are really working. My role as part of the governor's human trafficking task force is to train juvenile courts across the state of Ohio on what trafficking looks like, providing technical assistance on any sort of response that they might be creating around identified victims. And so that's really part of that process as well, is doing those trainings for juvenile courts and trying to provide technical assistance and education.
Gotcha. So courts, DYS, just one very small part of the entire continuum. We're talking about human trafficking. You mentioned the governor's human trafficking task force. What is your role? What is the purpose of the task force ultimately?
Yeah, so the task force is comprised of about 16 different state agencies, and those state agencies really come together to try to talk about how, as a state and within our systems, we can be working on human trafficking efforts. And they focus on 3 different pillars. So there's prevention work, protection, and prosecution. And so with prevention, we're talking about things that I kind of already mentioned, that screening, identification, trying to catch things earlier on. And then the trainings as well, so that educating professionals, but also making sure that hopefully our youth are getting that education as well. And then when we talk about protections, we're talking about things like safe housing, shelters, things that victims can access when they're identified as victims of trafficking. And then when we're looking at prosecution, we're all talking about how we can better identify traffickers. How can we do better things around investigation and successful prosecution of traffickers? So all of these state agencies are coming together to try to focus on those 3 pillars across the state and work on our systems to better identify and respond to human trafficking.
And what have you done to help specifically? Because I know from my research and reading that when you were put on the task force, that you help with these protocols to help people have kind of a process or an approach to how to handle or approach people who could be suspected victims and survivors.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've done is created a child response toolkit. That's not just me. It's been a bunch of members of the task force that have come together to author this child response protocol. And it really helps to build a tool for individuals or agencies to access information on how to build a response in their community, their organization, or their agency. And that's been something that's been really great to be able to put out to the community so that we can try to help build a framework for people to build a response.
So everything in this realm so far has been people who are directly involved, or at least in a sense, direct sense here in Ohio, but you're also doing stuff state level to people beyond that perspective, national level as well. So who is in these audiences? What message are you trying to get across when you're talking to people at state and national conferences?
Yeah, so primarily the state and national conferences that I've been involved with are individuals who are working in some way with justice involved people. So it could be corrections conferences, it could be people who are working as CASAs or GALs. They're involved with the courts in some way. And so from that perspective, I think one of the biggest messages that we're trying to get across is that there is an intersection between people who are involved in the justice system and being victims. One of the things that I think it can be really hard is when someone is in a system and labeled as a criminal, it is hard to also then see that they could be a victim. And 2 things can be true. They can both have committed a crime and be a victim of another crime. And so it's so important for us to understand and recognize that there are victims in our system, and we need to figure out how to identify those victims and properly respond to those. One of the other things with the state and national conferences that we've been talking more about is the idea of labor trafficking. I think we might talk about that a little bit more as well, but really just is sex trafficking is talked about a lot more than labor trafficking. And because we know, again, that traffickers require individuals to commit crimes as part of their trafficking, labor trafficking is something we're really trying to focus on more. And so that's been something we've been talking about state and national levels as well, is the idea of what we call forced criminality. So individuals required to commit crimes as part of their trafficking. So I think those are two of the biggest things that we focus on when we're talking at those levels.
So why, I guess going back on, obviously the sex trafficking aspect is maybe a little more clear, a little more obviously violent in that respect. What message or what kind of messaging do you have in general with the idea of recognizing and prioritizing labor trafficking as well?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of things that we're focusing on, but one of the things is how can we identify best practices around screening specifically when it comes to labor trafficking? And that's one of the things moving forward that we're really trying to focus on, is how can we ask better questions around labor trafficking to get those identifications. We know that it exists, but it's being underreported, underidentified. And I also think that we tend to identify female victims of trafficking easier than we do male victims of trafficking. So really just focusing on what does labor trafficking really look like. And it's not always in context of like legal jobs, right? It's not just someone working on a farm who's not getting paid, although that is a form of labor trafficking. That's not the only type. It could be individuals who are forced to run or sell drugs, forced to commit theft and bring those profits back to their trafficker. Things that we label as criminal activity can be part of labor trafficking as well.
Yeah, very true. So I know that's part of your push here for 2025 as we try to thrive in 2025. Any other policies or any other things you're trying to spread or implement more and more, whether it's within the agency or beyond the agency, and this year and beyond?
Yeah, I think really that labor trafficking piece is what we're focused on. So my hope is to update our screening this year and the next year or so to focus on labor trafficking. So really educating myself more on some of those best practices around labor trafficking, and then update our policies to reflect that as well. So that, again, we can do a better job of identifying labor trafficking. I think we do a pretty good job of identifying sex trafficking. And so we want to get to that level with labor trafficking as well.
Between the two, I guess, what are maybe some things that you would recognize in one versus the other?
Oh man, that's hard, because I think one of the things that we've moved away from is kind of a checkbox or red flags around human trafficking, because it can look like so many different things. And so it can be hard to identify. But I do think when we're talking about teens, if they have more material possessions that are expensive than you would think a normal teenager would have. So maybe they have the newest phone all of the time, the newest shoes, the newest bags or purses that are expensive, and you're wondering, how did someone that age get these things? That could be a really clear indicator that something like that is going on. It could be an indicator of something else, but it is something that maybe, okay, that throws up a concern. Let's ask more questions around that. The difference between sex and labor trafficking, I think, again, it can be really difficult, but one of the only other things that I'll mention related to sex trafficking that would be different than labor trafficking is maybe some health concerns. So if someone has persistent health concerns that could be in line with sex trafficking victims, that could be a clearer indicator of sex trafficking rather than labor trafficking.
I see. So we're very invested in the community, trying to build a safer Ohio through each youth and family we serve. For anyone listening or watching who'd like to get involved in human trafficking prevention, what kind of offer, what kind of suggestions, what can they do?
Yeah, so I would recommend going to humantrafficking.ohio.gov, which is the governor's Human Trafficking Task Force website. The reason that I recommend that is because there's a ton of great resources on there, including news and updates that get put out every month around what's going on around the state. But the other thing is there is a map of Ohio with coalitions on there. So there's coalitions across the state of local communities that are working to combat human trafficking. And so if you go to that coalition map, you can look at your county and see, okay, this is where my coalition is, this is the contact information, this is how I can get involved. So it's a great resource to be able to access that and try to find a way that you could get involved locally with your community.
Chelsea, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Coming up on our next episode, we'll be chatting with DYS staff from Behavioral Health. I'll be joined by Bureau Chief of Behavioral Health Services, Ryan Smith, and others from his team. They'll talk with us about the issues and trauma youth carry with them when entering DYS and how the behavioral health care providers work to address underlying problems and behaviors. Be sure to subscribe to the Future in Focus podcast and let others know about it too. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or watch our video recording on the Ohio DYS YouTube channel. Thanks for listening and watching. We look forward to having you with us for our journey through juvenile justice here at DYS.